History books told only half the truth. For generations, the stories of enslaved women in America remained hidden behind sanitized textbook narratives that spoke of plantations in abstract terms and slavery as a distant, impersonal institution. Tonight, we uncover what they never taught you about the daily realities, hidden strengths, and quiet resistances of women who survived one of humanity's darkest chapters through courage that history forgot to record. Picture a mist-covered plantation in South Carolina, 1850. The morning air carries the sound of a bell calling workers to another day of uncompensated labor. Among those who rise before dawn are women whose names appear in no history book, yet whose daily acts of survival, resistance, and love shaped the very foundation of American society. Their stories begin where textbooks end, in the quiet spaces where real life happened. What the classroom never revealed was the complex world that enslaved women created within the brutal constraints imposed upon them. Far from being passive victims, these women developed intricate networks of survival, communication, and mutual support that operated beneath the surface of plantation life. They were mothers, healers, teachers, leaders, and rebels who found ways to maintain their humanity in a system designed to deny it. Sarah, an enslaved woman on a Virginia plantation, understood this complexity intimately. Each morning at 4:30, she would rise in the cramped quarters she shared with 7 other women and begin a day that required her to be simultaneously invisible and indispensable. She worked as a house servant, which meant she had access to information, resources, and opportunities that field workers did not. But it also meant navigating a dangerous world where the wrong word, expression, or gesture could result in punishment that extended far beyond herself. The morning routine in the quarters was a carefully choreographed dance of efficiency and mutual aid. Women shared the single wash basin, helped braid each other's hair, and passed along whispered information about the day ahead. Who was sick? Which overseer was in a temper? Had anyone heard news from the road? These conversations happened in voices too low for outsiders to hear, but they formed the communication network that kept the community informed and protected. The soft light of dawn, filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls, illuminated faces that carried stories no textbook would tell. Some women bore scars from punishments that served as warnings to others. Others carried the exhaustion of mothers who had worked all day and then stayed up tending sick children with remedies passed down through generations of women who had learned to heal because no doctor would treat them. What educators never explained was how enslaved women became the keepers of cultural memory and family history in communities where literacy was forbidden and family ties were constantly threatened by sale and separation. They memorized the names and stories of relatives sold away, creating oral archives that preserved connections across time and distance. They taught children about grandparents they would never meet, maintaining family identities that slaveholders tried to erase. These women developed their own educational systems within the tight restrictions of plantation life. Unable to read or write legally, they found other ways to pass on essential knowledge. They taught each other about medicinal plants, childcare, cooking techniques that could stretch meager rations, and survival strategies that meant the difference between life and death in a world that offered little margin for error. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their lives, the part that no classroom discussion ever captured, was their capacity for creating joy and beauty in circumstances designed to crush the human spirit. In the evening hours, when the day's labor was done, enslaved women would gather to sing, tell stories, and maintain cultural traditions that connected them to their African heritage and to each other. The sounds of evening in the quarters told a different story than the one preserved in historical documents written by white observers. There was the rhythmic sound of women pounding corn for the next day's meals, the soft humming of lullabies that helped children fall asleep despite their hunger, the whispered conversations where women shared worries, hopes, and plans that had to remain secret from those who claimed to own them. Mary, who worked in the fields during cotton season, understood the delicate art of resistance that allowed enslaved women to maintain some measure of agency within total oppression. She knew exactly how slowly she could work without triggering punishment, how to feign illness convincingly when her body was pushed beyond endurance, how to communicate with other workers through seemingly innocent songs that carried coded messages about escape routes, helpful contacts, and dangers to avoid. The intelligence networks that enslaved women maintained were sophisticated operations that would have impressed professional spies. House servants overheard conversations about financial difficulties, political developments, and family tensions that affected plantation life. This information was carefully shared with trusted members of the community through systems of communication that relied on everything from the arrangement of laundry on clotheslines to the selection of vegetables from gardens. What the sanitized history never revealed was how enslaved women navigated the sexual exploitation that was a constant threat in their daily lives. They developed strategies for protecting themselves and their daughters that ranged from seeking the intervention of influential white women to creating networks of mutual protection among themselves. Some formed relationships with enslaved men who could offer physical protection. Others learned to manipulate the desires and fears of white men to their advantage, walking a dangerous line between compliance and resistance. The night air in the plantation quarters carried more than the sounds of exhaustion and suffering. It carried the whispered prayers of women who maintained faith despite circumstances that might have destroyed anyone's belief in divine justice. These prayers were offered in languages that slaveholders couldn't understand, invoking ancestors and traditions that predated their enslavement, drawing on spiritual resources that no amount of physical brutality could eliminate. Motherhood under slavery presented challenges that no textbook adequately described. Enslaved women knew that any children they bore would become the legal property of their masters, that they could be separated from their babies at any time, that they had no legal rights to protect or guide their own offspring. Yet they continued to love, nurture, and fight for their children with a fierce determination that found ways to express itself despite overwhelming odds. These mothers developed elaborate strategies for teaching their children survival skills while maintaining their sense of self-worth and family connection. They told stories that conveyed important lessons about navigating plantation hierarchy without explicitly challenging it. They taught their children to read the moods and intentions of white authority figures. Most importantly, they somehow conveyed to their children that their worth as human beings was not determined by their legal status as property. The economic knowledge that enslaved women possessed was far more sophisticated than historical accounts suggested. They understood the relationship between cotton prices and their own living conditions. They knew which plantation families were struggling financially and might be forced to sell enslaved people to pay debts. They tracked the seasonal rhythms of agricultural work and planned their own resistance activities accordingly, knowing when overseers would be distracted and when punishment would be most severe. Some enslaved women became skilled in trades that gave them a measure of independence and earning power. They worked as seamstresses, cooks, midwives, and healers, developing expertise that made them valuable not just to their owners, but to the broader community. These skills sometimes allowed them to travel between plantations, carrying information and maintaining connections that helped knit together a network of resistance and support that extended far beyond individual properties. The moonlight that filtered through the thin walls of the quarters witnessed planning sessions where women shared information about escape opportunities, discussed the best times to attempt running away, and evaluated the risks and benefits of various routes to freedom. These conversations required enormous trust, because the wrong person overhearing could result in severe punishment or death, not just for the potential runaway, but for anyone who had knowledge of the plan. What schools never taught was how enslaved women created their own economies within the constraints of plantation life. They traded skills, favors, and resources among themselves, creating systems of mutual aid that helped everyone survive the daily challenges they faced. A woman skilled in herbal medicine might trade treatments for mending services. Someone with access to extra food might exchange it for childcare. These informal economies operated parallel to the official plantation economy and provided enslaved people with some measure of control over their daily lives. The relationships between enslaved women and the white women who legally owned them were far more complex than popular history suggested. While the power imbalance was absolute and the potential for abuse constant, some enslaved women learned to navigate these relationships in ways that provided protection for themselves and their families. They became confidants, advisors, and sometimes the only source of practical wisdom available to isolated plantation mistresses who had little experience managing households or caring for children. In the early hours before dawn, when the plantation was still quiet and the day's surveillance had not yet begun, enslaved women found moments of privacy to tend to their own spiritual and emotional needs. They prayed for absent family members, remembered the dead, and maintained connections to cultural traditions that slavery was designed to destroy. These were acts of resistance as profound as any physical rebellion, because they asserted the fundamental humanity that the legal system denied. The first signs of dawn would bring another day of challenges that required enslaved women to be constantly alert, adaptable, and strong in ways that most people could never imagine. They would need to navigate racial hierarchy while maintaining their sense of self, protect their families while working for those who could destroy them, and find hope in circumstances that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Yet somehow they not only survived, but created communities, preserved cultures, and raised children who would eventually be free. As the sun rose over countless plantations across the American South, it illuminated a world where enslaved women were simultaneously the most powerless and most powerful people in the social order. Powerless because they had no legal rights, no official voice, and no protection from those who claimed to own them. Powerful because they were the ones who actually kept households functioning, children alive, communities connected, and cultural traditions preserved. The warmth of the morning sun on their faces was a daily reminder that they were still alive, still human, still capable of feeling beauty despite the ugliness that surrounded them. This awareness of their own humanity, maintained against overwhelming odds, would become the foundation for resistance movements, freedom struggles, and ultimately the transformation of American society. The women themselves might not have lived to see freedom, but their strength, wisdom, and determination created the conditions that made freedom possible for future generations. What they never taught in school was that these women were not just victims of history, but active agents who shaped the course of events in ways that are still being discovered today. Their stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there are always those who find ways to preserve dignity, maintain hope, and create foundations for a better future. Their legacy lives on in the strength they passed to their children, the wisdom they preserved against all odds, and the example they set of how to remain human when everything around you is designed to deny your humanity. The complexity of daily life for enslaved women extended far beyond the simple narratives found in textbooks. Each day required making dozens of calculated decisions about when to speak and when to remain silent, when to comply and when to resist, when to trust and when to protect information that could mean the difference between life and death for themselves or others in their community. Consider the intricate knowledge that house servants like Sarah accumulated about the white families they served. They knew which plantation owner was drinking too heavily, which family member was accumulating debts, which marriages were troubled, and which children were being groomed to take over plantation management. This information was more than gossip. It was intelligence that could be used to predict changes in living conditions, opportunities for negotiation, and potential dangers that might affect the entire enslaved community. The quiet hours after midnight were often the only time enslaved women had for themselves. In these stolen moments, they would mend their own clothes, tend to personal needs that had been deferred all day, and sometimes find a few minutes for reflection or prayer. These were precious hours when they could drop the careful masks they wore during daylight hours and simply exist as themselves, without constant vigilance about how their words or actions might be interpreted by those who held power over them. Religious life among enslaved women was far more complex than the simplified accounts found in most historical texts. While plantation owners often required attendance at white-controlled religious services, enslaved women maintained their own spiritual practices that blended Christian elements with African traditions and Native American knowledge they had absorbed. These practices were usually hidden from white observers, but played a crucial role in providing emotional and psychological strength for daily survival. The strategies that enslaved women used to maintain family connections across the barriers created by slavery were remarkable in their creativity and persistence. They memorized detailed family histories, maintaining oral records that could reconstruct kinship networks, even when family members were sold to distant plantations. They taught children to recognize family names and stories, creating psychological bonds that could survive physical separation. Food preparation became an art form among enslaved women who had to create nutritious and satisfying meals from inadequate supplies. They learned to use every part of any animal that was available, to supplement official rations with plants they gathered from woods and fields, and to stretch ingredients through techniques passed down from their mothers and grandmothers. These culinary skills were not just about survival. They were expressions of creativity and cultural identity that helped maintain community bonds and individual dignity. The sounds of night in the plantation quarters revealed layers of life that daylight concealed. There were the whispered conversations between mothers and children, the quiet weeping of those who grieved for lost family members, the soft singing that helped babies fall asleep despite hunger and discomfort. But there were also moments of laughter, gentle teasing between friends, and the warm sounds of human connection that persisted even in the midst of systematic oppression. Marriage and romantic relationships among enslaved people operated under rules that had been created by the enslaved community itself, since their unions had no legal recognition or protection. Enslaved women often played crucial roles in facilitating these relationships, serving as matchmakers, witnesses, and sources of advice for couples trying to build families under impossible circumstances. Healthcare among enslaved women was a community responsibility that required extensive knowledge of herbal medicine, basic surgery, and psychological care. Women who showed aptitude for healing often became informal doctors for their communities, treating everything from minor injuries to serious illnesses with remedies they had learned from African traditions, Native American sources, and through careful experimentation. The dawn chorus of birds that awakened the plantation each morning provided a natural soundtrack for the beginning of another day that would test the strength, intelligence, and determination of enslaved women in countless ways. As they rose from inadequate rest to face the demands of another day, they carried with them the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had survived similar challenges. As we drift toward sleep, listening to the echoes of these women's voices across the centuries, we can begin to appreciate the full scope of what they never taught in school about the lives of enslaved women in America. These were not simple stories of oppression and victimization, but complex narratives of human beings who found ways to maintain their dignity, protect their families, preserve their cultures, and create hope for the future under circumstances that would have destroyed anyone with less strength and wisdom. The legacy of these remarkable women extends far beyond their own lifetimes or the period of slavery itself. The techniques they developed for building community under adverse conditions, the strategies they created for preserving family connections across barriers, and the wisdom they accumulated about human nature and social dynamics became resources that later generations would draw upon during Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era, and the Civil Rights Movement. Their influence can be traced through the generations of children they raised, teaching them not just how to survive, but how to maintain hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. These children grew up to become the leaders, educators, activists, and community builders who would shape American society long after slavery had ended. The values and strategies they learned from their mothers and grandmothers became the foundation for movements that would transform the nation. The evening wind that whispered through the plantation quarters carried more than the sounds of daily life. It carried the prayers, dreams, and determination of women who refused to be defined by their circumstances. They understood that their current situation was not permanent, that their children might see freedom, and that the strength they demonstrated in their daily lives would echo through generations yet to be born. What they never taught in school was that these women were the true architects of American resilience, the unacknowledged builders of communities that would outlast the system that oppressed them. Their stories remind us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there are always those who choose hope over despair, love over hatred, and the long work of building better futures over the temporary satisfaction of revenge or surrender. They were, and forever remain, the embodiment of truly unbreakable human strength and enduring dignity, always. The bonds between enslaved mothers and children were forged in defiance of a system designed to break them. Tonight, we explore the hidden strategies that women developed to protect their families, build communities, and preserve connections that slavery tried to destroy. These are the untold stories of love as resistance, of mothers who found ways to shield their children from a world that claimed to own them. Picture a quiet moment in the slave quarters of a Georgia plantation, 1852. A mother named Hannah sits with her 7-year-old daughter, carefully braiding her hair by the light of a small fire. To any observer, this appears to be a simple, tender moment between parent and child. But within that gentle act lies a complex web of protection, instruction, and love that textbooks never captured. Every stroke of Hannah's fingers through her daughter's hair carries a message. The tight braids aren't just for appearance. They're practical armor against the lice that plagued overcrowded quarters. The patterns she creates tell stories that connect the child to African ancestors she will never know. Most importantly, these quiet minutes together provide opportunity for whispered lessons about survival that no master would approve. Yet every enslaved child needed to learn. What educators never explained was how enslaved mothers developed elaborate codes for communicating essential information to their children. They couldn't explicitly warn them about the dangers they would face, couldn't directly teach them to distrust authority, couldn't openly discuss the brutal realities of their situation. Instead, they crafted stories, songs, and games that carried survival wisdom disguised as entertainment. The evening air in the quarters carried the sound of mothers singing lullabies that were far more than simple melodies. These songs contained geographical information about safe houses and dangerous areas. They included coded messages about which white people might show mercy and which ones to avoid at all costs. They preserved family histories and cultural traditions that linked children to a heritage that slavery couldn't erase, no matter how hard it tried. Motherhood under slavery required a delicate balance between teaching children to survive within the system while maintaining their sense of self-worth and human dignity. Enslaved mothers had to somehow convey to their children that while they must obey masters and overseers to avoid punishment, their obedience didn't reflect their true worth or destiny. This psychological navigation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of enslaved parenthood. The soft glow of firelight in the quarters illuminated faces that bore the strain of carrying impossible burdens. Every enslaved mother lived with the knowledge that her children could be sold away at any moment, that she had no legal right to protect them, that their future depended on the whims and financial needs of people who saw them as property rather than human beings. Yet somehow they continued to love, nurture, and fight for their children's well-being. Rebecca, who worked as a cook in the big house, understood the strategic advantages that came with her position. She had access to information about the master's financial situation, his mood, his plans for buying and selling enslaved people. She also had access to better food, which she carefully shared with mothers in the quarters who were nursing babies or caring for sick children. These small acts of mutual aid created networks of support that helped entire communities survive. The community of enslaved women functioned as an extended family system, where everyone shared responsibility for protecting and raising children. When a mother was sold away, other women stepped in to care for her children, maintaining connections to their absent parent through stories, songs, and reminders. When a mother died, the community absorbed her children, ensuring that no child was left completely alone in a hostile world. What history books missed was the sophisticated communication network that connected enslaved women across plantations, states, and regions. Women who traveled as personal servants carried messages between separated family members. Those who worked in kitchens shared information with delivery people and traveling craftsmen. These networks operated like underground telegraphs, carrying news about births, deaths, sales, and escapes across vast distances. The morning mist that rose from the river near the plantation carried more than moisture. It carried the prayers of women who had risen before dawn to steal a few moments of solitude, to petition whatever powers they believed in for the safety and well-being of their children. These early morning rituals provided psychological and spiritual strength that helped them face another day of protecting their families within a system designed to destroy family bonds. Childcare among enslaved communities was a collective responsibility that went far beyond simple babysitting. Older women who could no longer perform heavy labor became the keepers of children, teaching them practical skills, cultural traditions, and survival strategies. These grandmothers and great-grandmothers served as libraries of knowledge, preserving information about family histories, medicinal plants, cooking techniques, and spiritual practices. The education that enslaved children received from their mothers and community was comprehensive, despite being unofficial. They learned to read facial expressions and body language to gauge the moods of authority figures. They learned which tasks to perform quickly and which ones could be done slowly without triggering punishment. They learned to be simultaneously invisible and indispensable, protective and protected, individual and part of the community. Pregnancy among enslaved women brought both hope and terror. Hope because children represented continuity, family, and future possibilities. Terror because those same children would be born into bondage, would face all the dangers and degradations that their mothers knew too well. Pregnant women received special protection and care from their communities, but also faced the agonizing knowledge that they were bringing new slaves into the world. The sound of rain on the cabin roofs provided cover for conversations that had to remain secret. During storms, when overseers stayed inside and normal plantation routines were disrupted, enslaved women would gather to share information, plan assistance for those in need, and discuss strategies for protecting their families. These meetings were informal but crucial, creating the social bonds that held communities together. Discipline within enslaved families operated according to different rules than those imposed by masters and overseers. Enslaved parents had to teach their children to avoid behaviors that would bring punishment from white authority figures, while also instilling values of dignity, resistance, and hope. This required enormous skill in communicating complex messages about when to comply and when to assert their humanity. The seasonal rhythms of plantation life created different challenges and opportunities for family protection. During harvest times, when everyone worked long hours and oversight was intense, mothers developed strategies for maintaining contact with their children despite minimal time together. During winter months, when work was less demanding, they had more opportunity for teaching and bonding, but also faced the stress of making inadequate supplies last through the cold months. Medical care for enslaved children was largely provided by women in the community who had developed expertise in treating common illnesses and injuries with available resources. These informal healers became essential figures in enslaved communities, combining knowledge from African traditions with plants and remedies they discovered in their new environment. Their skills often meant the difference between life and death for vulnerable children. The psychological warfare that enslaved mothers waged against the dehumanizing effects of slavery was subtle but persistent. They found ways to remind their children that they were loved, valued, and worthy of respect, even when the entire system around them suggested otherwise. They created moments of beauty, joy, and celebration that contradicted the narrative of worthlessness that slavery tried to impose. Financial strategies among enslaved women were sophisticated despite their limited access to money and resources. They created informal credit systems, shared resources strategically, and found ways to accumulate small amounts of wealth through extra work, selling garden produce, or providing services. These financial networks provided security for families and resources for emergencies, escapes, or attempts to purchase freedom. The night sky above the plantation quarters witnessed countless scenes of mothers holding vigil over sick children, of women taking turns caring for each other's babies so everyone could get some rest, of grandmothers passing down stories that connected children to ancestors and heritage. These nighttime activities created bonds that sustained communities through decades of hardship and separation. Resistance among enslaved mothers took many forms, most of them invisible to the masters and overseers who thought they controlled every aspect of enslaved life. They slowed down work when pregnant women needed rest. They shared food when some families had less than others. They provided alibis and cover stories when someone needed to slip away for family reasons. These small acts of defiance created space for humanity within an inhumane system. The emotional labor of maintaining hope and dignity in the face of constant dehumanization was enormous. Yet enslaved mothers somehow found ways to model resilience and strength for their children. They demonstrated through their daily actions that it was possible to maintain personal integrity even while being forced to comply with unjust demands. This lesson in moral courage became one of their most important legacies. Cultural transmission among enslaved families happened through countless small interactions that preserved African traditions, created new American customs, and adapted to changing circumstances. Cooking techniques, spiritual practices, storytelling traditions, and artistic expressions were passed from generation to generation by women who understood that culture was one of the few things that masters couldn't completely control or take away. The web of relationships that enslaved women created extended beyond their own plantations to include connections with free black communities, sympathetic white allies, and other enslaved populations throughout the region. These networks provided information about escape routes, legal changes, and opportunities for freedom. They also created emotional support systems that helped women cope with the isolation and stress of their situations. Migration and separation were constant threats that shaped every aspect of family life under slavery. Mothers prepared their children for the possibility that they might be separated, teaching them to remember family names, stories, and connections that could help them find each other later. They created mental maps of relationships and locations that could guide children through a world where family ties had no legal protection. The morning sun that rose over the plantation quarters each day illuminated the faces of women who had survived another night of protecting their families through love, wisdom, and quiet resistance. They'd found ways to create bonds that slavery couldn't break, to pass on values that oppression couldn't destroy, and to build communities that would outlast the system that tried to crush them. What they never taught in school was that these women didn't just endure slavery, they actively worked to transform it from within, creating spaces of humanity and dignity that provided foundations for future freedom. Their legacy lives on in the children they protected, the communities they built, and the networks of resistance they created. They proved that even the most oppressive systems cannot completely destroy the human capacity for love, hope, and connection. As the gentle sounds of night settle around us, we can hear the echoes of their voices carried on the wind, reminding us that behind every statistic about slavery were real mothers who loved their children, real families who found ways to stay connected, and real communities that created the conditions for eventual freedom. Their stories continue to teach us about the power of love to overcome hatred, of hope to transcend despair, and of human connections to survive even the most determined attempts to break them apart. The documentation of family life under slavery was necessarily limited during the antebellum period, as enslaved people had little access to writing materials and faced severe punishment for literacy. However, the records that survived reveal the sophisticated strategies that women developed for maintaining family connections and protecting their children. Letters dictated to sympathetic whites, oral testimonies recorded after emancipation, and physical artifacts preserved by families provide glimpses into the complex emotional and practical challenges of enslaved motherhood. The seasonal rhythms of family life under slavery reflected the agricultural calendar that dominated plantation operations. During planting and harvest seasons, families had less time together as work demands intensified. But during winter months and periods between major agricultural activities, enslaved families found opportunities for extended time together, for teaching and learning, and for the kinds of intimate family activities that help maintain bonds despite the constant threat of separation. Teenage children faced particular challenges as they approached adulthood under slavery. Enslaved mothers had to prepare their teenage daughters for the sexual exploitation that was a constant threat. while also teaching them strategies for protection and resistance. They had to help their teenage sons understand the dangerous dynamics of racial hierarchy while maintaining their sense of masculine dignity and self-respect. These conversations required enormous skill and wisdom. The economic aspects of family life under slavery were complex and often heartbreaking. Enslaved women knew that their children represented financial assets to their masters, that healthy children increased the plantation's wealth, and that their own worth was often measured by their reproductive capacity. This knowledge created psychological burdens that free women never had to bear, adding another layer of complexity to the already difficult task of raising children under oppression. Naming practices among enslaved families often reflected both African traditions and American adaptations. Children might receive African names used within the family, alongside English names required by masters. Some families developed coded naming systems that preserved family histories and cultural connections while appearing to comply with white expectations. These naming practices helped maintain cultural identity and family connections across generations. The role of fathers in enslaved families was complicated by the legal system that gave them no rights over their children and limited ability to protect their families. However, enslaved fathers found ways to participate in family life and child rearing that worked within the constraints of slavery. They taught practical skills, provided emotional support, and sometimes took extraordinary risks to protect their wives and children from abuse or separation. Extended family networks among enslaved people often included fictive kinship relationships that expanded beyond blood relations to include community members who took on family roles. These chosen families provided additional support systems for children and adults, creating redundant networks of care that could function even when biological families were disrupted by sale or death. The psychological impact of family separation was devastating and long-lasting for enslaved people who lost contact with loved ones. However, the hope of eventual reunion sustained many people through years of uncertainty and grief. Some families were reunited after decades of separation, while others never found their missing members despite years of searching. The emotional toll of these separations affected entire communities, not just the directly affected families. Funeral and mourning practices among enslaved families had to accommodate both African traditions and the restrictions imposed by plantation life. When family members died, enslaved communities found ways to honor their memory and provide comfort to survivors, despite limitations on gatherings and expressions of grief. These mourning rituals helped families process loss and maintain connections to deceased relatives. The celebration of births within enslaved families was bittersweet, combining joy at new life with sorrow at bringing children into bondage. However, these celebrations also represented hope for the future and affirmation of family bonds. Enslaved women developed rituals and traditions around childbirth that provided community support for new mothers and welcomed children into the extended family network. Marriage ceremonies among enslaved people often combined legal impossibility with deep emotional and spiritual significance. While enslaved marriages had no legal recognition, they carried profound meaning within enslaved communities. These ceremonies often incorporated African traditions, Christian elements, and new customs developed specifically within the context of American slavery. The educational strategies that enslaved mothers used to prepare their children for adulthood had to balance practical survival skills with moral and cultural values. Children needed to learn how to navigate the dangerous realities of slavery while maintaining their sense of human dignity and worth. This educational process was necessarily subtle and often disguised as play or everyday conversation. Conflict resolution within enslaved families required special sensitivity to the broader context of powerlessness and oppression. Family disputes that might be minor under normal circumstances could become serious problems when family members had no legal recourse and limited ability to change their circumstances. Enslaved women often served as mediators and peacemakers within their families and communities.
The adaptation strategies that enslaved families developed varied depending on their specific circumstances, including the size and type of plantation, the personality of masters and overseers, regional differences in slavery practices, and proximity to free black communities or sympathetic whites. Families had to constantly assess their situations and adjust their strategies accordingly. The legacy of enslaved family strategies can be seen in the strong family traditions that developed within African American communities after emancipation. The emphasis on extended family networks, community child-rearing, mutual aid, and cultural preservation all had roots in the survival strategies that enslaved families developed during bondage. These traditions provided important resources for African Americans during the difficult periods of Reconstruction and Jim Crow segregation. The international context of family separation under slavery connected American experiences to the broader Atlantic world of slave trading and plantation agriculture. Enslaved people in America were part of a larger diaspora of African peoples who had been forcibly separated from their families and communities. Understanding this broader context helps explain some of the cultural patterns and survival strategies that emerged within American enslaved communities. The legal challenges that faced enslaved families continued even after emancipation, as former slaves struggled to establish legal family relationships, locate missing relatives, and gain custody of children who had been separated during slavery. The Freedmen's Bureau and other organizations worked to help families reunite, but the process was often slow and sometimes unsuccessful. The resilience demonstrated by enslaved families in maintaining relationships despite overwhelming obstacles provides important lessons about the power of human connections and the importance of family bonds. Their strategies for survival and resistance became models for later generations facing different but related challenges, including segregation, economic discrimination, and social prejudice. The stories of enslaved families remind us that even in the most oppressive circumstances, human beings find ways to create meaning, maintain dignity, and express love for one another. They show us that family bonds can survive separation, that community support can substitute for missing relatives, and that hope for reunion can sustain people through decades of uncertainty. These lessons remain relevant for anyone facing family challenges or community disruption. Knowledge was power, and enslaved women knew it. In a world where literacy was forbidden and education was illegal, they became the guardians of a different kind of learning. Tonight, we uncover the hidden classrooms, secret schools, and ingenious methods that enslaved women used to preserve culture, pass on wisdom, and prepare their children for a future they might never live to see, but refused to stop believing in. In the pre-dawn darkness of a South Carolina plantation, 1845, a woman named Celia gathered 3 children around a small pile of glowing embers. To any observer, she appeared to be tending the fire before the day's work began. But hidden beneath the ordinary activity was an extraordinary act of rebellion. She was teaching the children to read, using charcoal on pieces of bark, forming letters in the soft earth, creating an education system that operated in complete defiance of the law. What textbooks never revealed was the sophisticated network of underground education that enslaved women created and maintained across the South. They understood that knowledge was the key to freedom, that literacy could open doors that physical escape could not. So they developed methods for teaching that were invisible to their masters, but effective enough to create a generation of enslaved people who could read and write despite laws designed to keep them ignorant.
The morning light filtering through the cracks in the cabin walls illuminated scenes that would have shocked plantation owners if they had been aware of them. Children learning to trace letters in the dirt with sticks. Women memorizing Bible verses and passing them along to others who couldn't read. Older slaves teaching younger ones to recognize important words like free, north, and danger that could mean the difference between life and death on the road to freedom. Cultural preservation among enslaved women went far beyond simple storytelling. They maintained complex systems of knowledge that included medicinal practices from Africa, agricultural techniques adapted to American conditions, spiritual beliefs that blended multiple traditions, and artistic expressions that connected communities across plantations and regions. These women became living libraries, preserving information that would have been lost forever if they had not made deliberate efforts to pass it on. The evening gatherings in the slave quarters served multiple purposes that masters and overseers never fully understood. What appeared to be simple socializing was actually a sophisticated system of information sharing, cultural transmission, and community building. Stories that seemed like entertainment carried practical knowledge about survival. Songs that sounded like harmless amusement contained geographical information and coded messages about escape routes and safe houses. Susanna, who had learned to read from her former master's daughter before being sold to a different plantation, became an underground teacher for her new community. She held secret classes in the woods during rest periods, using leaves as paper and berry juice as ink. She taught not just reading and writing, but also basic arithmetic that could help enslaved people understand contracts, bills of sale, and legal documents that affected their lives. The sound of night insects provided cover for whispered lessons that took place after the official workday ended. In these stolen hours, enslaved women would gather small groups of children and teach them skills that went far beyond what was needed for plantation labor. They taught navigation by the stars, recognition of edible plants, basic medical care, and most importantly, critical thinking skills that would help them evaluate opportunities and dangers in a complex world. Religious instruction among enslaved communities was far more sophisticated than the simplified Christianity that masters tried to impose. Enslaved women preserved and transmitted complex theological understanding that blended African spiritual traditions with Christian teachings and Native American beliefs they had absorbed. This religious education provided not just spiritual comfort, but also intellectual framework for understanding justice, morality, and hope. The practical education that enslaved women provided to their children was comprehensive and essential for survival. They taught them to read the subtle signs of mood and intention in white faces, to understand the unspoken hierarchies within plantation society, to recognize opportunities for advancement or escape, and to navigate the complex social dynamics that determined their daily experiences and long-term prospects. Memory techniques developed by enslaved women were remarkably sophisticated. Born from necessity in a world where written records were dangerous, and information had to be preserved in human minds. They created elaborate systems for remembering family genealogies, geographical landmarks, legal information, and cultural traditions. These mental libraries became repositories of knowledge that could be accessed and shared even when physical books were forbidden. The moonlight that cast silver shadows across the plantation grounds witnessed countless scenes of clandestine education. Women teaching children to count using pebbles and sticks. Groups memorizing passages from forbidden books that sympathetic whites had shared. Lessons in geography conducted using drawings in the dirt that would be erased before dawn to leave no evidence of the illegal education that had taken place.
Historical knowledge preservation was one of the most important functions that enslaved women served for their communities. They maintained detailed oral histories that included not just family stories, but also broader historical events, political developments, and social changes that affected enslaved people. This historical consciousness helped communities understand their experiences within larger contexts and maintain connections to past and future. Language skills among enslaved women often included multiple African languages, English, and sometimes French or Spanish depending on regional influences. They served as translators and interpreters within their communities, helping newly arrived Africans adapt to American conditions while maintaining connections to their cultural heritage. These multilingual abilities also provided advantages in gathering information and communicating across different groups. The seasonal cycles of plantation life created different opportunities for educational activities. During busy agricultural periods, learning had to happen in brief moments stolen between tasks. During winter months, when indoor work predominated and daylight hours were shorter, there were more opportunities for extended teaching sessions. Enslaved women became experts at adapting their educational methods to available time and circumstances. Scientific knowledge among enslaved women was extensive and practical, covering everything from astronomy for navigation to botany for medicine and nutrition. They understood weather patterns, soil conditions, plant biology, and animal behavior in ways that often exceeded the knowledge of their masters. This scientific understanding was passed on through hands-on teaching that prepared children to be observant, analytical, and resourceful. Legal education, though necessarily limited, was another crucial component of the knowledge that enslaved women transmitted to their communities. They learned about laws affecting enslaved people, understood legal procedures for manumission and purchase of freedom, and shared information about court decisions and legal precedents that might affect their situations. This legal awareness helped communities make informed decisions about resistance, escape, and negotiation. The artistic traditions that enslaved women preserved and taught served multiple purposes beyond aesthetic expression. Songs carried coded information. Quilt patterns conveyed messages about escape routes. Pottery designs maintained connections to African heritage, and storytelling techniques preserved both entertainment and practical knowledge. These artistic skills provided both cultural continuity and practical communication tools. Mathematical skills were often more advanced among enslaved people than their masters realized. Women who managed household budgets, calculated crop yields, and tracked complex work assignments developed sophisticated numerical abilities. They taught these skills to children through games, songs, and practical applications that disguised the mathematical learning taking place. The soft sounds of dawn birds beginning their songs marked the end of another night of secret education in the slave quarters. As women prepared to begin another day of visible compliance with the demands of slavery, they carried with them the satisfaction of having passed on knowledge that masters could never take away. They had created scholars in the darkness, built libraries in human minds, and established schools that existed wherever enslaved people gathered to learn. Communication networks that connected enslaved communities across vast distances were maintained largely through the efforts of women who understood the importance of sharing information and knowledge. They created systems for passing along news about legal changes, opportunities for freedom, dangerous situations to avoid, and success stories that provided hope and practical guidance for others seeking to improve their situations. The psychological education that enslaved women provided to their children was perhaps the most important and difficult aspect of their teaching responsibilities. They had to help children understand their legal status as property
while maintaining their sense of human dignity and worth. They had to teach compliance with unjust demands while fostering critical thinking and moral judgment. This psychological navigation required enormous skill and wisdom. Technical skills training among enslaved women created a workforce that was often more competent and knowledgeable than their legal status suggested. Women taught each other advanced cooking techniques, textile production, agricultural methods, construction skills, and medical procedures. These technical abilities provided economic value that sometimes translated into better treatment or opportunities for earning money and purchasing freedom. The philosophical and ethical education that took place in enslaved communities was sophisticated and profound. Women taught children about justice, morality, and human rights, even though the legal system denied them all three. They created moral frameworks that helped people navigate impossible ethical dilemmas while maintaining their humanity and preparing for eventual freedom. Innovation and adaptation were constant themes in the educational systems that enslaved women created. As conditions changed, laws evolved, and opportunities shifted, they modified their teaching methods and curriculum to meet new challenges. They demonstrated remarkable flexibility and creativity in developing educational approaches that could function within the constraints of slavery while preparing people for life beyond it. The legacy of these underground educational systems extended far beyond the period of slavery itself. The children who learned to read in secret became the teachers, ministers, politicians, and community leaders of the Reconstruction era. The knowledge preservation techniques developed by enslaved women influenced African American educational traditions for generations. The emphasis on learning as a pathway to freedom became a cornerstone of African American culture. As the night deepens and the stories of these remarkable educators fade into memory, we can appreciate the full scope of what they never taught in school about the intellectual life of enslaved communities. These women created universities without buildings, libraries without books, and schools without official recognition. They proved that the human desire to learn and grow cannot be legislated away, that knowledge will find a way to survive and flourish even in the most oppressive circumstances. Their example reminds us that education is not just about acquiring information, but about developing the capacity to think critically, to question assumptions, and to imagine better possibilities for ourselves and our communities. They understood that true education is liberation, that knowledge is power, and that the light of learning, once kindled, can never be completely extinguished by those who prefer to keep others in darkness. The assessment methods that enslaved women used to evaluate their students' progress were necessarily informal, but often sophisticated. They observed changes in behavior, confidence, and understanding, rather than relying on written tests that would have been dangerous to preserve. They could tell when a child had truly mastered a concept by watching how they applied new knowledge to practical situations or shared information with others. Technology adaptation within enslaved educational systems was creative and resourceful. When paper and ink were unavailable, teachers used charcoal on pieces of wood, berry juice on cloth scraps, or simply wrote in the dirt with sticks. They created counting systems using pebbles, taught geography using natural landmarks, and developed memory aids that could preserve information without written records. The cross-cultural exchange that occurred within enslaved educational networks was remarkable for its breadth and sophistication. African knowledge systems, Native American traditions, and European learning methods all contributed to the educational approaches that enslaved women developed. This cultural synthesis created new forms of knowledge that were uniquely American, while maintaining connections to multiple heritage traditions. Advanced learning among enslaved people often occurred through apprenticeship relationships, where experienced practitioners passed on complex skills to younger students. These apprenticeships covered everything from advanced medical techniques to sophisticated craft skills to complex spiritual practices. The knowledge transferred through these relationships often exceeded what was available in formal educational institutions of the time. The gender dynamics of enslaved education reflected both African traditions and American adaptations. Women often took primary responsibility for early childhood education and cultural transmission, while men might focus more on practical skills and protection strategies. However, these roles were flexible and adapted to the specific needs and opportunities available within individual communities. Quality control within enslaved educational systems was maintained through peer review and community oversight. Teachers were accountable to their communities for the effectiveness of their instruction and the safety of their methods. Students who advanced to become teachers themselves were expected to maintain the high standards established by their predecessors while adapting to changing circumstances. The psychological preparation that enslaved teachers provided to their students was as important as the academic content they transmitted. Students needed to understand not just how to read and write, but also when it was safe to demonstrate these abilities and when it was necessary to hide their knowledge. This psychological education was crucial for survival in a society that criminalized enslaved literacy. Research methods among enslaved people were sophisticated, despite their limited access to written sources. They learned to gather information through careful observation, systematic questioning of travelers and visitors, and analysis of overheard conversations. They developed techniques for evaluating the reliability of sources and distinguishing between accurate information and rumors or misinformation. The career development that occurred within enslaved educational networks provided pathways for advancement that existed parallel to the official plantation hierarchy. Individuals who demonstrated teaching ability, leadership skills, or specialized knowledge could gain respect and influence within their communities, even if their legal status remained unchanged. These alternative career paths provided motivation and direction for personal growth. Curriculum development among enslaved educators was responsive to changing community needs and opportunities. During periods when escape was more feasible, geography and navigation received greater emphasis. When legal changes affected enslaved people's status, law and politics became more important subjects. This adaptive curriculum ensured that education remained relevant and practical. The evaluation of educational outcomes among enslaved people focused on practical results rather than abstract achievements. Success was measured by whether students could apply their knowledge to improve their lives, protect their families, and contribute to their communities. This practical orientation ensured that education remained connected to real-world needs and challenges. Networking among enslaved educators created connections that extended across plantations, states, and regions. Teachers shared information about effective methods, warned each other about dangers, and coordinated their efforts to maximize the impact of their work. These professional networks operated with the same sophistication as any modern educational association. The funding mechanisms for enslaved education were creative and often invisible to masters and overseers. Communities pooled resources to support teachers, students contributed what they could in terms of materials or labor, and sometimes sympathetic whites provided covert assistance. These funding networks operated entirely outside the official economy, but were essential for maintaining educational activities. Innovation in educational methods among enslaved teachers was driven by necessity, but often resulted in approaches that were more effective than conventional techniques. The emphasis on practical application, peer teaching, and community relevance created learning environments that engaged students and produced lasting results. Some of these innovations influenced mainstream educational theory decades later. The documentation of educational progress among enslaved people was necessarily limited and often coded. Teachers might track student advancement through seemingly innocent activities like work assignments or social interactions. They developed systems for recognizing and acknowledging achievement that didn't attract unwanted attention from authorities. The international connections of enslaved educational networks included correspondence with abolitionists, connections to free black communities in other countries, and awareness of educational developments in Africa and Europe. These connections provided inspiration, resources, and validation for the educational work being conducted within American enslaved communities. The transition from clandestine to open education after emancipation revealed the extent and sophistication of the underground educational systems that enslaved women had created. Many of the first teachers in Freedmen's Bureau schools were people who had been secretly educated during slavery. Their knowledge and experience provided crucial foundations for the rapid expansion of African American education during Reconstruction. The institutional legacy of enslaved educational networks can be seen in many of the historically black colleges and universities that were established after emancipation. The emphasis on practical education, community service, and cultural preservation that characterized these institutions reflected the educational values and methods that had been developed during slavery. The influence of enslaved educational traditions extended beyond African American communities to affect broader American educational development. The emphasis on experiential learning, community involvement, and practical application that characterized enslaved education influenced progressive educational movements and contributed to innovations in teaching methods and curriculum design. The courage and dedication of enslaved educators provided inspiration for later generations of teachers and community leaders who faced different but related challenges in providing education to underserved populations. Their example demonstrated that committed individuals could create effective educational programs even without official support or adequate resources. Freedom was not a destination, but a journey that began long before enslaved women set foot on roads leading north. Tonight, we explore the hidden strategies, dangerous alliances, and calculated risks that women took in their quest for liberation. These are the untold stories of escape, resistance, and the Underground Railroad's most crucial yet overlooked participants. The road to freedom often began in the heart of an enslaved woman who had reached the moment when survival was no longer enough. For Maria, that moment came on a cold February morning in 1854, when she learned that her 10-year-old son was to be sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. Standing in the kitchen of the Virginia mansion where she had worked for 15 years, she made a decision that would change everything. She would not let her child disappear into the vast machinery of slavery. What history classes never taught was how the Underground Railroad depended not just on famous conductors like Harriet Tubman, but on networks of women who provided safe houses, gathered intelligence, and created the communication systems that made escape possible. These women risked their lives daily, not for glory or recognition, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had helped another human being step closer to freedom. The moonless nights that provided cover for escape attempts also witnessed the careful preparations that made the difference between successful flight and recapture. Enslaved women who planned escapes had to consider every detail: weather patterns, work schedules, patrol routes, safe houses, food supplies, and the capabilities of anyone who would travel with them. These plans often took months or years to develop, and required patience that tested every limit of human endurance.
Intelligence gathering among enslaved women was sophisticated and dangerous work that required extraordinary skill in reading people, situations, and opportunities. House servants like Maria had access to conversations about financial difficulties, political developments, and travel plans that could affect escape timing. They overheard discussions about slave patrols, knew which overseers were most vigilant, and understood seasonal patterns that might provide windows of opportunity. The sound of wind through pine trees provided natural camouflage for the whispered conversations where escape plans were shared, refined, and sometimes abandoned when circumstances changed. These planning sessions required absolute trust, because betrayal meant not just punishment for potential runaways, but also for anyone who had knowledge of their intentions. The women who participated in these conversations held the power of life and death in their hands. Disguises and deception were essential tools that enslaved women used to facilitate escapes. They learned to forge passes, alter clothing to suggest different social status, and teach runaways how to behave like free people rather than escaped slaves. Some women became experts at creating believable cover stories that could fool suspicious whites who might question travelers on isolated roads. The geographical knowledge that enslaved women possessed was often extensive and detailed, acquired through years of listening to travelers, reading maps when possible, and gathering information from others who had attempted escape. They knew which rivers were fordable, which roads were heavily patrolled, which towns were sympathetic to fugitives, and which areas were best avoided entirely. This geographical intelligence was carefully preserved and passed on to those who needed it. Financial resources for escape were accumulated slowly and secretly through methods that masters never suspected. Women saved small amounts from selling garden produce, providing services like laundry or sewing, and through the informal economic networks that existed within enslaved communities. They also learned to hide money and supplies in locations that would survive searches by suspicious overseers. The psychological preparation for escape was as important as the physical planning. Enslaved women had to overcome a lifetime of conditioning that taught them to accept their situation, to fear the consequences of resistance, and to doubt their ability to survive in a hostile world. They had to develop the mental strength to leave behind family members who couldn't escape, to face unknown dangers, and to persist through hardships that would test every limit of human endurance. Support networks for escape attempts extended far beyond individual plantations, to include free black communities, sympathetic whites, and other enslaved populations throughout the region. These networks operated like underground railroads, providing safe houses, transportation, food, clothing, and guidance to runaways. Maintaining these networks required constant communication and coordination among people who could rarely meet openly. The timing of escape attempts was crucial and required careful consideration of multiple factors. Women had to wait for optimal conditions, favorable weather, distracted overseers, seasonal work patterns that would delay discovery of their absence, and alignment with the schedules of their support networks. Many escape attempts failed because timing was wrong, emphasizing the importance of patience and strategic thinking. The early morning hours before dawn provided cover for the first crucial miles of escape attempts, when runaways needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and pursuing slave catchers. These hours also witnessed the tearful farewells between mothers and children, husbands and wives, who knew they might never see each other again, but understood that freedom for some was better than slavery for all. Survival skills that enslaved women taught to potential runaways were comprehensive and practical. They included navigation by stars and natural landmarks,
identification of edible plants and safe water sources, basic medical care for injuries and illness, and techniques for avoiding detection by slave patrols. These survival skills often made the difference between successful escape and death in the wilderness. Communication with family members left behind was one of the most painful aspects of escape for enslaved women. They developed systems for sending messages through the networks of people who traveled between plantations, but these communications were dangerous and unreliable. Many women who achieved freedom never learned the fate of children and relatives they had been forced to leave behind. The safe houses that provided refuge for escaped slaves were often maintained by women who understood the risks they were taking, but felt compelled by moral conviction to help others achieve freedom. These women provided not just temporary shelter, but also clothing, food, medical care, and guidance for the next leg of the journey. Their courage and compassion were essential components of the Underground Railroad. Legal knowledge among enslaved women who helped facilitate escapes was often sophisticated, covering topics like manumission laws, free papers, legal procedures for claiming freedom, and court precedents that might affect fugitive slaves. This legal understanding helped them advise runaways about their options and rights, though legal protections for escaped slaves were minimal throughout much of the country. The winter nights that made travel more difficult for escaped slaves also provided better cover from pursuit and longer hours of darkness for movement. Women who planned winter escapes had to consider the additional challenges of cold weather, limited food availability, and the physical demands of traveling through snow and ice. These seasonal considerations affected every aspect of escape planning and execution. Recapture was a constant threat that haunted escaped slaves and those who helped them. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 increased the dangers by requiring free states to cooperate in returning escaped slaves to their masters. This legal development forced Underground Railroad networks to adapt their methods and extend their routes further north, often into Canada, where escaped slaves could find genuine safety. The psychological impact of successful escape extended far beyond the individuals who achieved freedom. News of successful escapes spread through enslaved communities, providing hope and inspiration that sustained others through difficult times. These success stories also served as proof that freedom was possible, that the system of slavery was not unbreakable, and that resistance could succeed. Adaptation to freedom presented new challenges for women who had lived their entire lives under slavery. They had to learn to navigate a world where they were legally free, but still faced discrimination, economic hardship, and social prejudice. Many became activists and educators, using their experiences to help others still trapped in slavery and to build communities that could support newly freed people. The stories of failed escape attempts were as important as success stories, though they were often forgotten or suppressed. These stories provided lessons about what didn't work, what dangers to avoid, and what preparations were insufficient. They also honored the courage of people who died trying to achieve freedom, recognizing that their sacrifice contributed to the eventual success of others. The documentation of escape attempts and Underground Railroad activities was necessarily limited during the period of slavery, but some records were preserved by participants who understood the historical importance of their actions. These documents provide glimpses into the complex networks of cooperation that made escape possible, and the extraordinary courage of women who risked everything to help others achieve freedom. The legacy of women's participation in escape networks and resistance activities extended far beyond the abolition of slavery. The organizational skills, strategic thinking, and moral courage that they developed became foundations for later civil rights activities, women's rights campaigns, and social justice movements. They proved that oppressed people could organize effective resistance even under the most difficult circumstances. The transportation methods used by escaped slaves were diverse and creative, ranging from walking hundreds of miles to hiding in wagons, boats, and even railroad cars. Women who coordinated these transportation networks had to understand schedules, routes, and the trustworthiness of various contacts. They became experts in logistics and coordination, managing complex operations that required precise timing and flawless execution. The dawn light that broke over American roads in the 1850s often illuminated scenes that challenged everything the country claimed to believe about freedom and justice. It shone on women walking north with children in their arms, on families separated by the violence of slavery but united in their determination to be free, and on communities of people who understood that true freedom required action, not just hope. As we listen to the echoes of their footsteps on the long roads to freedom, we can begin to understand what they never taught in school about the role of enslaved women in achieving liberation. They were not passive victims waiting for others to free them, but active participants in their own liberation and that of their communities. They planned, organized, risked, and sacrificed in ways that changed the course of American history and proved that the desire for freedom cannot be forever suppressed. Their courage reminds us that freedom is not a gift that some people give to others, but a right that belongs to all human beings and a goal that requires constant vigilance, sacrifice, and commitment to achieve and preserve. They showed us that even in the darkest times, there are always those who will choose the dangerous path to freedom over the safe path to continued oppression, and that their courage can light the way for others to follow. Their courage reminds us that freedom is not a gift that some people give to others, but a right that belongs to all human beings and a goal that requires constant vigilance, sacrifice, and commitment to achieve and preserve. They showed us that even in the darkest times, there are always those who will choose the dangerous path to freedom over the safe path to continued oppression, and that their courage can light the way for others to follow. The seasonal planning that escape attempts required was sophisticated and reflected deep understanding of agricultural cycles, weather patterns, and social routines that governed plantation life. Spring escapes took advantage of longer days and better traveling weather, but faced the challenge of increased field work and closer supervision. Summer escapes benefited from maximum daylight and abundant food sources, but had to contend with intense heat and active slave patrols. Fall escapes could take advantage of harvest chaos and food availability, but faced the approaching winter. Winter escapes provided maximum darkness and reduced patrol activity, but presented severe survival challenges. The supply networks that supported escape attempts were complex and required careful coordination among multiple participants. Food had to be preserved and hidden for weeks or months before escape attempts. Clothing suitable for travel had to be acquired without arousing suspicion. Maps, compasses, and other navigation aids had to be obtained through trusted contacts. Money for emergencies had to be saved gradually over long periods. These supply chains operated with the efficiency of military logistics operations. Training programs for potential runaways were comprehensive and covered physical, psychological, and practical preparation. Physical conditioning helped prepare people for the demands of long-distance travel on foot. Psychological preparation helped develop the mental toughness needed to persist through hardship and danger. Practical training covered navigation skills, survival techniques, and strategies for avoiding detection. This training often took place over months or years before actual escape attempts. The communication systems that coordinated escape attempts used multiple channels and backup methods to ensure reliability. Primary communications might travel through trusted intermediaries who moved between plantations. Secondary channels could include coded messages in letters, signals through arranged objects or activities, and information passed through commercial networks. Backup systems ensured that critical information could still reach intended recipients if primary channels were compromised. Risk assessment for escape attempts was continuous and multifaceted, requiring evaluation of personal circumstances, environmental conditions, and broader social and political factors. Personal factors included health status, family obligations, and individual skills and capabilities. Environmental factors covered weather, seasonal conditions, and local geography. Social and political factors included patrol activity, legal changes, and the reliability of support networks. The decision-making process for escape attempts involved complex calculations of risks and benefits that had to account for multiple variables and uncertainties. Potential escapees had to weigh their chances of success against the consequences of failure, consider the impact on family members who would be left behind, and evaluate whether their skills and resources were adequate for the challenges they would face. These decisions were among the most difficult that human beings could be asked to make. Alternative strategies for achieving freedom included purchase, legal manumission, gradual accumulation of privileges, and negotiation with masters. Some enslaved women worked for years to save money to purchase their freedom or that of family members. Others sought manumission through long and faithful service. Some negotiated for increased privileges that provided steps toward eventual freedom. These alternative strategies required different skills and resources than escape attempts, but could be equally challenging and time-consuming. The psychological impact of escape attempts extended beyond the direct participants to affect entire enslaved communities. Successful escapes provided hope and inspiration that freedom was possible. Failed attempts served as cautionary examples, but also demonstrated courage and determination. The knowledge that some community members were planning or attempting escape created an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that affected everyone's daily experience. Counterintelligence activities by enslaved people included deliberate misinformation campaigns designed to confuse slave catchers and protect escape routes. False information about escape timing, routes, and destinations was sometimes spread to throw pursuers off track. Decoy activities might be arranged to draw attention away from actual escape attempts. These counterintelligence efforts required careful coordination and posed significant risks to the people who implemented them. The technological tools available for escape attempts were limited, but used creatively by people who understood their importance for survival. Compasses were highly valued, but difficult to obtain. Maps were rare and often had to be memorized or recreated from verbal descriptions. Simple tools for survival, such as knives, fire-making equipment, and basic medical supplies, could mean the difference between life and death during escape attempts. Team dynamics among groups attempting escape together were crucial for success, but also created additional complications. Groups had to move at the pace of their slowest members, make decisions by consensus or clear leadership, and manage interpersonal conflicts under extreme stress. Larger groups provided mutual support and protection, but were harder to conceal and feed. Smaller groups or individual escapes were easier to hide, but provided less mutual assistance. The legal landscape that governed escape attempts was complex and varied significantly by state, time period, and local circumstances. Federal laws, like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, increased penalties for assisting runaways and required free states to cooperate in recapturing escaped slaves. State laws varied in their severity and enforcement. Local ordinances might create additional restrictions or provide unexpected opportunities. Understanding this legal environment was crucial for planning successful escapes. Medical preparations for escape attempts were essential, given the physical demands and health risks involved in long-distance travel under difficult conditions. Basic medical supplies had to be acquired and carried despite weight limitations. Knowledge of medicinal plants and basic medical procedures could be life-saving during escape attempts. Pre-existing health conditions had to be considered when planning escape routes and timing.
The economic impact of escape attempts affected both individual families and broader enslaved communities. Successful escapes represented significant financial losses to masters, which could result in increased restrictions or punishments for remaining enslaved people. Failed escape attempts often resulted in the sale of participants to more distant and restrictive situations. These economic consequences had to be weighed against the potential benefits of successful escape. Regional variations in escape strategies reflected differences in geography, law enforcement, and local culture across different areas of the South. Escapes from coastal areas might involve water transportation and knowledge of shipping routes. Mountain region escapes could take advantage of difficult terrain that hindered pursuit but required specialized survival skills. Border state escapes had shorter distances to free territory, but often faced more intensive patrol activity. The role of children in escape attempts presented particular challenges and opportunities. Very young children could not be left behind, but were difficult to keep quiet and calm during dangerous moments. Older children could be valuable assistants, but also faced severe punishments if escape attempts failed. Some families attempted escapes gradually, getting one member to safety before attempting to rescue others. These decisions required agonizing choices between family unity and individual survival. Documentation and record-keeping related to escape attempts were necessarily minimal during the period of slavery, but some information was preserved by participants who understood its historical importance. Coded diaries, symbolic artwork, and oral histories preserved information about escape routes, safe houses, and successful techniques. These records provide valuable insights into the organization and effectiveness of underground railroad networks. The international dimensions of escape attempts connected American experiences to broader patterns of resistance and liberation movements around the world. Some escapees fled to Canada, Mexico, or other countries where slavery was illegal. These international connections provided additional escape routes and destination options. The success of these international escapes influenced American anti-slavery activism and provided models for other resistance movements. Adaptation and learning from escape experiences occurred continuously as participants refined their methods based on successes and failures. Information about effective techniques, dangerous areas, and reliable contacts was shared throughout underground railroad networks. Failed escape attempts provided lessons that improved future efforts. This continuous learning process made escape attempts more successful over time and contributed to the eventual success of the broader freedom movement. The spiritual and emotional preparation for escape attempts was as important as physical and practical planning. Many escapees reported that faith, hope, and determination were essential for surviving the physical and psychological challenges of the journey to freedom. Prayer, meditation, and community support helped provide the emotional strength needed for such dangerous undertakings. These spiritual resources often made the difference between success and failure when other resources were exhausted. The seeds of freedom were planted long before the Emancipation Proclamation made slavery illegal.
Tonight, we conclude our journey through the hidden lives of enslaved women by exploring their lasting legacy, the transformation they helped create, and the lessons their courage continues to teach us about human resilience, dignity, and hope. When news of emancipation reached the plantation quarters in the spring of 1865, it found communities that had been preparing for freedom for generations. The women who received this news were not empty vessels waiting to be filled with new possibilities. They were experienced organizers, skilled educators, accomplished healers, and proven leaders who had been creating the foundations of free society within the constraints of slavery for decades. What textbooks never revealed was how the skills, networks, and knowledge that enslaved women had developed during bondage became the building blocks of Reconstruction and beyond. The secret schools became public schools. The underground communication networks became political organizations. The survival strategies became business practices. The community bonds became the foundation for churches, societies, and institutions that would serve African Americans for generations. The morning of freedom dawned over plantation quarters where women had already been practicing freedom in small, dangerous ways for years. They had been making decisions about their children's education, their families' health care, their community's welfare, and their own spiritual lives. When legal freedom arrived, they were ready to expand these practices into the broader world, not start them from nothing. Mary, who had taught children to read by firelight in the quarters, became one of the first teachers in the Freedmen's Bureau schools that sprang up across the South. The patience, creativity, and determination she had developed during years of secret education served her well as she worked to provide formal learning opportunities to people who had been denied them for centuries. Her story was repeated thousands of times across the region. The transformation from slavery to freedom was neither immediate nor complete. The women who had survived bondage found themselves facing new challenges: economic exploitation, legal discrimination, social hostility, and political violence. But they also found themselves with new tools: legal rights, political participation, economic opportunities, and social institutions that they could shape and control. The evening light that had once illuminated secret gatherings in slave quarters now shone on public meetings where formerly enslaved women organized schools, churches, and mutual aid societies. The skills they had developed for protecting their families and communities during slavery became the foundation for building new institutions that could serve the needs of free people in a hostile environment. Economic independence was one of the first priorities for newly freed women, who understood that freedom without financial security was fragile and incomplete. They used the trade skills they had learned during slavery to establish businesses. They formed cooperative societies to pool resources and share risks. They negotiated labor contracts that provided better terms than sharecropping arrangements that often recreated many of the worst aspects of slavery. Political participation became another avenue for formerly enslaved women to exercise their newfound freedom, even though legal restrictions prevented them from voting until decades later. They organized political meetings, supported candidates who represented their interests, and lobbied for legislation that would protect and advance the rights of freed people. Their political engagement was sophisticated and effective, despite their exclusion from formal political power. The sound of church bells ringing across the South marked another transformation in the lives of formerly enslaved women. They now had the freedom to worship as they chose, to build their own churches, to select their own ministers, and to practice their own forms of spirituality. The churches they established became centers of community life that provided not just spiritual guidance, but also education, social services, and political organization.
Family reunification was one of the most urgent priorities for women who had been separated from children, spouses, and relatives during slavery. They used the communication networks they had maintained during bondage to search for missing family members. They placed advertisements in newspapers, traveled hundreds of miles to investigate rumors about relatives, and sometimes discovered family members they had given up for dead decades earlier. Education remained a central focus for formerly enslaved women who understood that literacy and learning were essential for meaningful freedom. They sent their children to the new schools that were established throughout the South. They attended adult education classes themselves. They supported teachers and educational institutions with whatever resources they could spare. Their commitment to education transformed Southern society and created opportunities that had never existed before. The challenges of Reconstruction tested every skill and strategy that formerly enslaved women had developed during bondage. When white supremacist groups used violence and intimidation to reverse the gains of Reconstruction, these women drew on their experience with resistance and survival. When economic exploitation threatened their families, they used their knowledge of cooperation and mutual aid. When legal discrimination limited their opportunities, they found creative ways to work around unjust restrictions. The migration patterns that began during Reconstruction reflected the determination of formerly enslaved women to find places where they could exercise their freedom more fully. Some moved to cities where economic opportunities were better. Others traveled to states where legal protections were stronger. Many moved to reunite with family members from whom they had been separated during slavery. These migration decisions required the same careful planning and risk assessment that had characterized escape attempts during the antebellum period. The winter nights of freedom brought new kinds of gatherings, where formerly enslaved women could plan and organize without fear of discovery or punishment. They formed literary societies, benevolent associations, and political organizations that advocated for their rights and the welfare of their communities. These organizations became training grounds for leadership and vehicles for social change that would influence American society for generations. Leadership roles among formerly enslaved women expanded dramatically after emancipation. Women who had been informal leaders within enslaved communities became formal leaders of churches, schools, and community organizations. They developed new skills in public speaking, financial management, and political advocacy. Some became nationally recognized figures who influenced policy and public opinion about the rights and capabilities of African Americans. The cultural legacy of enslaved women became more visible and influential after freedom arrived. The songs, stories, and artistic traditions they had preserved during bondage became important components of African American culture. Their cooking techniques influenced American cuisine. Their medical knowledge contributed to folk healing traditions. Their spiritual practices shaped African American religious expression. Documentation of their experiences became possible after emancipation, when formerly enslaved women could speak openly about their lives without fear of punishment. Some wrote autobiographies, others gave interviews to historians and journalists, and many shared their stories with children and grandchildren who preserved them for future generations. These accounts provide invaluable insights into the experience of slavery and the process of achieving freedom. The institutional legacy of formerly enslaved women is visible today in many of the historically black colleges and universities, churches, and community organizations that they helped establish during Reconstruction and the following decades. These institutions provided education, social services, and leadership development that sustained African American communities through the difficult periods of Jim Crow segregation and beyond. The influence of formerly enslaved women extended beyond African American communities to affect broader American society.
Their advocacy for education influenced public school development throughout the South. Their organizational skills contributed to the women's rights movement. Their political engagement helped shape Reconstruction policy and civil rights legislation. Their entrepreneurship contributed to economic development in communities across the region. The resilience that enslaved women had demonstrated during bondage became even more important during the backlash against Reconstruction. When legal segregation replaced slavery as the primary means of racial control, these women drew on their experience with resistance and adaptation. They found ways to protect their families and communities despite discriminatory laws and violent intimidation. The intergenerational transmission of knowledge, values, and strategies continued after emancipation, as formerly enslaved women shared their experiences with children and grandchildren who had been born free. This transmission helped prepare future generations for the challenges they would face and preserved important cultural and historical knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The innovation and adaptation that had characterized enslaved women's approach to survival continued to serve them well in freedom. They modified their strategies to fit new circumstances, developed new skills to meet new challenges, and created new institutions to serve new needs. Their flexibility and creativity were essential factors in the successful transition from slavery to freedom. The moral authority that formerly enslaved women had earned through their suffering and resistance became an important force in American society. Their voices carried special weight in debates about justice, equality, and human rights. They used this moral authority to advocate for policy changes and social reforms that would benefit not just African Americans, but all Americans who faced discrimination and injustice. The sunrise that brought each new day of freedom to formerly enslaved women also brought reminders that their work was far from finished. True freedom would require generations of struggle, organization, and sacrifice. But they had laid the foundation for that struggle with their courage, intelligence, and determination. They had proven that human dignity could survive even the most oppressive circumstances, and that hope could flourish even in the darkest times. As we reach the end of our journey through the hidden lives of enslaved women in America, we can see clearly what they never taught in school about these remarkable individuals. They were not passive victims, but active agents of their own liberation and that of their communities. They were not broken by their experiences, but strengthened by them. They were not defined by their oppression, but by their resistance, their love, their hope, and their determination to create a better world. Their legacy lives on in every person who chooses hope over despair, love over hatred, and action over resignation. It lives on in every community that comes together to protect its most vulnerable members, in every school that opens doors to knowledge and opportunity, and in every individual who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. They showed us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there are always those who keep the light of human dignity burning, who preserve the possibility of freedom, and who prepare the ground for justice. The night breeze that carries their voices across the centuries whispers a truth that every generation must learn anew. That freedom is not a destination, but a journey, not a gift, but a responsibility, not an individual achievement, but a collective endeavor. They remind us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, that the cost of justice is continuous struggle, and that the reward for both is the possibility of human dignity for all people, everywhere, always. The night breeze that carries their voices across the centuries whispers a truth that every generation must learn anew. That freedom is not a destination, but a journey, not a gift, but a responsibility, not an individual achievement, but a collective endeavor. They remind us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, that the cost of justice is continuous struggle, and that the reward for both is the possibility of human dignity for all people, everywhere, always.
The comprehensive nature of social transformation that formerly enslaved women helped create extended beyond immediate concerns about legal freedom to encompass fundamental changes in American society, culture, and institutions. Their influence can be traced through the development of public education systems, the expansion of democratic participation, the evolution of family structures, and the emergence of new forms of community organization that would characterize American society for generations. The entrepreneurial activities that formerly enslaved women engaged in during Reconstruction and beyond demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of economic systems and their ability to adapt skills learned during slavery to new circumstances. They established businesses ranging from small domestic services to large-scale agricultural operations. They formed investment clubs and cooperative societies. They developed marketing strategies and built customer relationships that sustained their enterprises through difficult economic periods. The intellectual contributions of formerly enslaved women to American thought and culture were significant, but often unrecognized or attributed to others. They wrote autobiographies that provided crucial historical documentation. They developed educational curricula that influenced teaching methods. They created literary works that enriched American culture. They contributed to theological discussions that shaped American religious thought. Their intellectual legacy extended far beyond their own communities. The international awareness that formerly enslaved women possessed reflected their understanding that American slavery was part of a global system of oppression that affected people of African descent throughout the Americas and beyond. They maintained connections with liberation movements in other countries, corresponded with activists in Europe and Africa, and understood their struggle within the broader context of human rights and social justice worldwide. The technological innovations that formerly enslaved women contributed to American development were often uncredited, but nonetheless significant. They improved agricultural techniques, developed new food preservation methods, created more efficient household management systems, and invented tools and devices that solved practical problems. Their innovations reflected both traditional knowledge brought from Africa and new solutions developed in response to American conditions. The artistic expressions that formerly enslaved women created and nurtured became important components of American culture that influenced music, literature, visual arts, and performance traditions for generations. Spirituals evolved into blues and gospel music that would transform American popular culture. Narrative traditions influenced American literature and storytelling. Quilting patterns and other visual arts contributed to distinctly American artistic traditions. The healthcare innovations that formerly enslaved women developed during slavery continued to influence American medical practice long after emancipation. Their knowledge of herbal remedies contributed to pharmaceutical development. Their understanding of nutrition and disease prevention influenced public health practices. Their expertise in midwifery and maternal care provided foundations for improved medical care for women and children. The psychological resilience that formerly enslaved women demonstrated became a model for coping with trauma and adversity that influenced how later generations approached similar challenges. Their strategies for maintaining mental health under extreme stress, for processing traumatic experiences, and for building emotional support systems provided resources that benefited not just African American communities, but broader American society as well. The environmental knowledge that formerly enslaved women possessed contributed to sustainable agricultural practices and conservation efforts that helped preserve American natural resources. Their understanding of crop rotation, soil conservation,
and sustainable farming methods provided alternatives to exploitative agricultural practices that had damaged southern ecosystems. Their knowledge of plant biology and ecological relationships informed early conservation movements. The diplomatic